Before the story begins, let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a place and immediately known that you weren't welcome? It's not because you did something wrong. It's not because you can't afford it. It's simply because someone looked at you and decided you didn't belong there. If you've ever felt that way, stay with this story until the end. And if you believe that true stories, stories that touch on self-esteem and justice deserve to be shared, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel now. Not for me, but for those who have been looked down upon just like the character in this story. It was a light, drizzly evening at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The rain wasn't heavy, but enough to create long streaks of light from the airport lights on the glass. In the first-class lounge, where the aroma of strong roasted coffee mingled with the scent of leather and polished wood, a black man sat quietly in the corner of the room. He was wearing a dark gray hoodie, dark jeans. His sneakers had been cleaned, but weren't new. No gold watch, no suit, no assistant. If you just glanced at him, you'd think he was just a middle-aged man. Perhaps he'd just taken an early flight. Perhaps he'd be tired. Perhaps he didn't belong here. His name is Ethan Carter. Ethan didn't look around. He wasn't searching for anyone's gaze. He simply held his glass of water, his other hand resting on his phone, which had a scratched corner. In his mind, it wasn't the upcoming flight. It was the familiar question repeated over and over again throughout the more than 20 years he'd lived in this world. Will things be the same as always today? Ethan was used to being judged before being listened to. Used to glances that would linger for a second, then move on, as if he were nothing worth remembering. He remembers the first time it happened. Not in a large conference room, not when he signed a multi-million-dollar contract, but when he was a young engineer stepping into the elevator of his own company. A woman politely asked him, "Are you in the maintenance department?" Ethan smiled then. Not because he found it funny, but because he knew, if he reacted, he would be seen as overly sensitive. And tonight, as I sit in the first-class waiting room, that feeling comes back. He's not here to receive special treatment, nor is he seeking recognition. Actually, Ethan deliberately dressed like this. It wasn't a coincidence, nor was it because he had no other choice. 3 days ago, Ethan completed the biggest deal of his career, a deal that will change the lives of thousands of people. But nobody here knows that, and he wants to keep it that way. He wanted to know a simple truth. If no one knows who I am, how will they treat me? The boarding announcement sounded. Flight 728 to San Francisco is now boarding first-class passengers. Ethan stood up, carrying the old leather bag that had been with him for over 10 years. He took a very light breath. It wasn't because he was worried. It was because he had learned something in life. There are moments when you need to stay calm, not to endure, but to observe. He walked towards the gate, and there just minutes later, a series of events will begin. These are events so severe that by the end of the flight, none of the people involved can ever return to their old lives. What do you think would happen if someone who is looked down upon, yet holds the most power in the room? Stay here. The next part will begin as soon as Ethan puts his ticket on the boarding counter. Ethan Carter was standing in the first-class boarding line, but he wasn't standing as straight as the others. It's not because of a lack of confidence. It's because he's learned not to take up other people's space. He stood slightly to one side, his old leather bag neatly tucked under his feet. Around him, the other passengers looked quite different. Some wore gray suits, their wrists revealing gleaming Swiss watches. Others walked and talked on the phone, their voices deep and decisive. Some laughed loudly, patting the flight attendants on the shoulder as if they had known each other for a long time. Ethan observed everything silently. He doesn't compare. He simply observes. The boarding gate attendant looked at the line of people in front of her. Her gaze lingered on Ethan longer than usual. It wasn't a curious look. It was a judgmental look. "Sir," she said, her voice polite but cold. "First class is boarding right now." Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He held up his phone. The screen displayed his e-ticket. Seat 1A. The saleswoman didn't look at the screen right away. She looked down at his shoes first, then at his hoodie, then back at his face. Just a second. But Ethan was used to that moment. The moment when an invisible question pops into the mind of the person opposite. "Are you sure this person belongs here?" She scans the ticket. The machine beeps green. She returned the phone without smiling. "Go ahead. That's all." "No." "Welcome aboard." "No." "Enjoy your flight." Not a single superfluous phrase. Ethan walked away. As he passed through the jet bridge, the light from outside faded. The sounds of the airport were left behind. Only the distant sounds of footsteps and engines remained. He recalled why he was there. 3 days ago, in a closed-door meeting room in New York, Ethan signed a contract nearly 2 inches thick. An acquisition, not a small company, not an unknown brand. An airline. That airline is the one operating this 728 flight. The deal was made through a parent company. His name hasn't appeared in any press releases. Everything is in a transitional phase. His lawyer said, "You can wait a few weeks before making the announcement." Ethan shook his head. "No, I want to see the truth first." He doesn't want to listen to PowerPoint presentations. He doesn't want to see customer satisfaction charts. He wanted to sit down like an ordinary passenger. He wanted to know how this system treated people when no one knew who he was. It wasn't because of suspicion. It was because he had learned a valuable lesson very early on. When he was a young businessman, he once walked into a bank to apply for a line of credit. He was wearing a simple shirt, no tie, no suit jacket. The receptionist told him to wait for almost 40 minutes. Meanwhile, a white man in a suit entered 10 minutes after him. He was offered water and led straight to a private room. Finally, when it was Ethan's turn, the bank teller said, "I'm sorry, your profile isn't strong enough." 3 months later, that same bank called him, inviting him to collaborate on an investment. His company had just been valued at over $100 million. They apologized, but Ethan didn't forget. He doesn't hold grudges, but he does remember. And tonight on this flight, he wants to see what else he can remember. Stepping into the first-class cabin, Ethan immediately noticed the stark contrast. Spacious leather chairs, soft lighting, a quiet atmosphere. But people aren't as gentle as the light. A flight attendant stood near the door. She looked him up and down. No smiling, no greeting. "Boarding pass." "Ethan gave me the ticket, seat 1A. She read, her voice tinged with surprise but quickly masked. "Straight ahead." No further words. Another man stepped up after Ethan. Salt and pepper hair. Dark blue vest. The flight attendant changed her tone immediately. "Welcome back, sir. Let me take your coat." Ethan didn't turn around to look. He was used to being compared in silence. He walked to seat 1A, the first seat, by the window. He placed the bag in the overhead compartment. He sat down. The seat felt soft, but his heart was heavy. He looked out the window. The rain was still falling. A question echoed in his mind. A question he had asked himself many times in his life. If I weren't the CEO, if I were just Ethan, would I be respected? He knows the answer. He's just not used to it yet. A flight attendant walked by carrying a tray of drinks. "Stop at seat 1B. Pour champagne." "Stop at seat 2A. Pour some water." "Go past seat 1A. Do not stop." Ethan didn't call. He didn't signal. He was just observing. It's not because he's afraid. It's because he's letting things unfold naturally. There are some things that if you don't intervene will reveal themselves much more clearly. He leaned back in his chair. He took a slow breath. Two conflicting thoughts ran through his mind. On one side is weariness. The weariness of someone who has had to prove their worth their entire life. On the other side is sobriety. The sobriety of someone who knows that every action leaves a trace. And this flight has only just begun. The airplane door closed with a dry thud sound. That sound always had something very distinct about it, like a boundary. On one side was the ground. On the other was the sky. Ethan Carter sat upright in seat 1A, his hands resting casually on his lap. He didn't fasten his seatbelt immediately. He simply looked out the window, where raindrops were being cut into short streaks of light by the runway lights. A female voice came through the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 728 to San Francisco." The voice is clear and standard. It lacks emotion. It lacks personality. Ethan was familiar with that name. He'd flown hundreds of flights in his life. But this time he heard something different. It wasn't because of his voice. It was because he was listening more carefully than usual. As the plane began to taxi, the flight attendants moved along the first-class cabin. They checked luggage, adjusted the curtains, and leaned down to whisper a few pleasantries. No one stopped at seat 1A. Ethan noticed it, not with annoyance, but with a clear, attentive observation, like someone reviewing a video recording. A tall, blond male flight attendant stopped at seat 2A. He bent down and flashed his familiar smile. "Good to see you again, sir." Ethan didn't turn to look, but he heard everything clearly. That quote wasn't meant for him. Another flight attendant stopped at seat 1B, where the man in the dark blue suit was sitting. She asked about his drink, his trip, and the weather in San Francisco. Ethan remained silent. He doesn't want to break this picture. He wants to see it complete itself. As the plane took off, the thrust gently pressed against the back of the seat. The city of Atlanta gradually shrank beneath the gray clouds. At altitudes above 10,000 feet, the cabin lights dim. This is often where first class shows its difference. Hot towels, welcome drinks, a smile that's just enough to make passengers feel valued. Ethan waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Hot towels were brought to seat 2A, then 1B, then 2B. No one stopped at 1A. Ethan looked down at his hands. Those hands had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They had shaken hands with the most powerful people in the industry. But at this moment, it was just the two hands of a black man in a hoodie sitting silently in the front seat. He felt a slight constriction in his chest. No pain, not intense. It's just a familiar feeling. Like when you walk into a room and realize you have to prove your existence all over again. Ethan inhaled slowly, then exhaled. He said to himself, "Not yet. Let them continue." A flight attendant walked by pushing a drinks cart. She stopped at seat 1B. "Champagne or water, sir?" The man smiled. "Champagne, please." She poured, tilting the bottle perfectly. "No foam." She then moved to seat 2A, then 2B. As the car approached seat 1A, she paused for a moment. Just one beat. Her gaze swept over Ethan, not lingering on his face. It lingered on his hoodie. Then she pushed the cart onward. "Don't ask. Don't say." Antonio looked up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm, just loud enough to be heard. The flight attendant stopped and turned around. A polite smile appeared very quickly, almost reflexively. "Yes, sir. May I have some water, please?" She looked at him for a second. Then she looked at the car. "We're still getting settled, Kono. I'll come back." Her voice wasn't rude, but it wasn't warm either. She turned away. Ethan nodded. "Thank you." He leaned back in his chair. Two conflicting thoughts began to clash in his mind. One commenter said, "Maybe they're just busy. Don't jump to conclusions." The other voice whispered, "You already know about this." Ethan didn't choose a side. He just observed. 10 minutes have passed. The water hasn't arrived yet. He glanced over at seat 1B. The man in the blue suit had almost finished his glass of champagne. A flight attendant was leaning over to ask if he wanted more. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. It wasn't because he was sleepy. It was because he needed to keep his emotions from surfacing. He remembered his mother, a black woman who had worked her entire life in a public hospital, once said something to him that he would never forget. "My child, there are people who won't treat you badly because of what you do. They treat you badly because they think you have no right to fight back." When he was a child, Ethan didn't understand. Now, he understands perfectly. He opened his eyes. This time, he pressed the call button for the flight attendant. A small ding sound was heard. 1 minute passed. No one came. He pressed it again. This time, a male flight attendant appeared. He was still the blonde one. "Sir," he asked, "could I get some water?" The flight attendant looked around the cabin, then at Ethan. His expression showed a hint of displeasure, but it was quickly masked. "We have a limited supply right now, in H-Tanoi. I'll see what I can do." "Thank you," Ethan replied. The flight attendant turned away. Ethan leaned his head back against the seat. The window reflected his face, faintly. He saw himself in it. A 4-5-year-old man. He has come a long way, but in the eyes of others, he still stands at the same starting point. He wondered, not for the first time, if I reveal my identity, will everything change immediately? The answer is yes. He's absolutely certain of that. But he didn't want to change the outcome. He wanted to see the process. Because it is the process itself that reveals the essence. Another flight attendant walked by, this time a woman older than Ethan. She stopped and looked at Ethan. "Sir, did you order a special meal?" Ethan looked up. "Yes. I pre-ordered." She nodded. "Okay. No laughing. No explaining." But at least this time, he was recognized as a passenger who existed. The plane reached cruising altitude. Outside, the sky turned a deep, almost black blue. The first-class cabin was quieter. The clinking sound of food trays began to come from the back. Ethan looked at his watch. More than an hour had passed since boarding. He hasn't taken a sip of water yet. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't uncomfortably thirsty either. But he understood very well that this was no longer just about food or drink. It's a matter of who gets seen and who gets overlooked. And in the silence, Ethan sensed very clearly that a limit is approaching. The service vehicle began rolling through the first-class cabin. The sound of the small wheels touching the aircraft floor was clearly audible in the quiet space. No one spoke loudly. Everything was running smoothly in sync and according to procedure. At least that's the case for most people. Ethan Carter sat still in seat 1A, his eyes following the approaching car. He didn't lean forward. He didn't signal. He didn't show any signs of anticipation. He learned that in moments like these, expectations are what most easily lead to disappointment. The car stopped at seat 2B. The flight attendant leaned down and whispered something. A nod. A smile. The food tray was placed down. Everything was done gently and professionally. The car continued moving forward. Stop at seat 1B. The man in the blue suit looked up and smiled warmly. Smells great, he said. The flight attendant smiled back. Yes, sir. It's one of our most popular selections. Ethan heard every word clearly. The car stopped right in front of him. A very brief moment of silence. The flight attendant looked down at the clipboard, then looked up at Ethan, then looked down again. Sir, she said, her voice even. We have pasta or chicken. Ethan frowned slightly, very subtly, almost imperceptibly. I pre-ordered the short rib, he said. His voice wasn't loud, not harsh. The flight attendant let out a short sigh. She said, her eyes still fixed on the display. I don't see that here. Ethan remained silent for a second. Would you mind checking again, Anj Hawaii? I ordered it through the app yesterday. She looked up. Her gaze was no longer neutral. Sir, she said, her voice slightly higher than before. We only load a limited number of those meals. Ethan looked straight at her. I understand, Anj Dap, but I did receive a confirmation. 1 second passed. Then a sentence was uttered. Well, we don't have it. No apologies, no further explanation. That's all. Ethan looked down at the food tray in the car. Pasta. Chicken. He wasn't so hungry that he had to choose randomly. Could you check with the Gallianj Hoi? Or with your supervisor? The flight attendant placed her hand on her hip. It's unclear whether this was unconscious or intentional. Sir, you're holding up service. Her voice was loud enough for those around her to hear. Ethan felt the gaze from seat 2A, from seat 1B. No one said anything, but the atmosphere had changed. He inhaled. Slowly. I'm not trying to hold anything up, Inoi. I just want what I paid for. The flight attendant looked at him for another second. Then, she turned to the car. She bent down and pulled out a silver tray. It's not a ceramic tray. It's a thin silver tray wrapped in aluminum foil. She placed it on the table in front of Ethan. The sound of metal hitting plastic was dry and sharp. There you go, she said. Chicken. Ethan looked at the tray of food. He didn't touch it. He looked up. This isn't first class, he said. Not reproachful, not sarcastic. It's just a fact. The flight attendant shrugged. It's food, she replied. Isn't it? A few passengers bent down to look at their trays. White porcelain trays, neatly decorated. Then they looked at the silver tray in front of Ethan. Nobody said anything. Ethan felt a wave of heat run down his spine. It wasn't a fit of anger. It was something deeper. A familiar, feeling more painful than anger. Feeling belittled. He thought about all the times he had stayed silent, the times he had chosen to ignore it, the times he had told himself, it's not worth making a big deal out of. And he was also thinking about something else. He thought of the thousands of employees working for this airline. People who did their jobs correctly every day. People who had no idea that just a few individuals could harm everyone. He didn't want to turn this into a drama. But he also couldn't pretend it didn't happen. He placed his hand on the silver tray and gently pushed it away. May I speak to your supervisor on Hoi? His voice remained calm. The flight attendant chuckled softly. Not loudly, but loud enough to be heard. He's busy, Konoi. And I don't appreciate your tone. Ethan looked up. Which tone? She didn't answer. She just looked at him, her eyes cold. You're being aggressive. It then fell into the compartment like a heavy object. Aggressive. Ethan didn't move. He looked down at his hands. They were resting on his lap. Open. He looked around. No one stood up. No one intervened. He understood, not because they agreed, but because they didn't want to get involved. He nodded. "All right," he said. "Thank you." The flight attendant pushed the cart away. Without looking back, Ethan sat still. He didn't open the tray. He didn't eat. He took out his phone. He opened a note, not for writing, but for marking the time. He looked over at seat 1B. The man in the blue suit was cutting his piece of meat. He didn't look over. Ethan didn't blame him. He understood how that felt. When you have privileges, you rarely realize it until you see someone who doesn't. He leaned his head back against the chair. He closed his eyes for a moment. An old question echoed in his mind. Am I overreacting? Then another sentence clearer. If I stay silent this time, things will be even worse next time. Ethan opened his eyes. He wasn't angry, but he had made his decision. And when someone like Ethan Carter makes a decision, things are never the same again. The silver tray remained undisturbed on the table in front of Ethan Carter. The foil wrapper is still intact. No smell, no warmth. It was merely a lifeless object placed in the middle of the luxurious first-class cabin, like a misplaced period in a carefully crafted sentence. Ethan stared at the tray of food for a few more seconds. Then he closed the table. A small, almost imperceptible click echoed. But to Ethan it felt like a decision had been made. He didn't eat, not out of pride, but because he understood that if he ate, the story would end here. And there are some stories that shouldn't end too soon. Ethan leaned back in his seat. The soft light in the cabin reflected off the window, blurring his face. Outside, the sky was completely dark. Only a few distant stars twinkled. He thought back to another evening many years ago. At that time, he was still a middle manager. Once, while on a business trip, he also sat in first class. He was also overlooked. He was treated as if he were in the wrong place. That time, he chose to remain silent. He ate the food that was served. He got off the plane without saying anything. That evening, he called his mother. She listened silently to his story. Then she said something very softly. You can stay silent to avoid trouble, but don't convince yourself that it's normal. Ethan carried that saying with him for many years. And tonight, with the tray of cold food in front of him, he knew clearly this is no longer a personal matter. He reached into his hoodie pocket. He pulled out his phone, not for calling, not for texting. He opened the Notes app. Then he opened another app, a voice recorder app. He didn't raise his phone. He didn't point it at anyone. He simply placed it face down close to his thigh, as if it were a harmless habit. Ethan doesn't want to trap anyone. He doesn't want to make up stories. He just wanted the truth to have a voice of its own. At the front of the cabin, two flight attendants were standing and talking. Their voices weren't loud, but in the enclosed space the sound carried clearly. Did he complain again? A female voice asked. The other voice chuckled softly. Of course he did. Ethan looked out the window, as if he hadn't heard. He said he pre-ordered Jeong Nu Noi Tiep. You saw what he was wearing. A soft sigh. People always think they're entitled. Ethan didn't move. A question arose in his mind. Not an angry question, but a very sober one. If this is how they talk about a passenger, when they think no one can hear, then what else are they doing when no one is watching? He wasn't in a hurry to conclude. He simply continued to take notes. Another flight attendant walked by and stopped at seat 1A. Sir, is everything okay? The question sounded like it was asking something, but the look in his eyes didn't. Yes, Ethan Tralloy. Could I speak with the lead attendant when he's available? The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I'll let him know. She turned away. Ethan knew the answer. He'd heard it many times in his life. I'll let him know. It could mean maybe, or never. 10 minutes have passed. No one came back. The first-class cabin was almost finished with their meal. Several passengers had reclined their seats, put on their headphones, and closed their eyes to rest. Ethan remained seated upright. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, but his very existence seemed to have become an eyesore. He pressed the button to call the flight attendant. The ding sound rang out again. This time a man appeared. He was in his early 40s. Tall. His hair was neatly combed. He was wearing a name tag, Mark Reynolds. Sir Mark, said his voice polite but firm. I asked to speak with you, Ethan Noy, regarding my meal. Mark looked down at the locked folding table. Then he looked at the silver tray next to it. We had a catering discrepancy, Mark Noe. Unfortunately, these things happen. Ethan Gutdo. I understand mistakes happen in Noe. But I was given a different meal without explanation. Mark Mim Moy. Sir, our crew did their best. Ethan looked him straight in the eye. Did they? He asked. A moment of silence. Mark tilted his head slightly. Is there something else you need? Ethan thought for a moment. This was a moment he knew very well. A moment when if he stepped back, everything would slip away. But he also knew that if he continued, things would escalate. He thought of the thousands of other passengers. Those who didn't have the time, energy, or position to speak up. He chose to continue. I would like to file a formal complaint, Ethan Noy. And I would like it noted. Mark looked at him. His eyes darkened slightly. Sir Mark Noy had Jeong. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. Ethan's expression remained unchanged. I'm not NHDAP. I'm asking for accountability. The air around us seemed to thicken. A passenger in the back row looked up, then looked down again. Nobody wanted to be a part of this. Mark sighed. All right, he said. I'll document it. He turned away. Ethan didn't know if Mark had actually done it. But he didn't need to know. He did his part. He looked down at his phone. The recording app was still running. A tiny red dot. Very calm. He turned off the screen. It wasn't because he was afraid of being discovered. It was because he had heard enough. Ethan had a strange feeling inside him. It's not about winning. It's not about losing. It's about clarity. It became clear that from this moment on the story was no longer solely under his control. It's operating on its own, in keeping with the nature of the people involved. Ethan leaned back. He closed his eyes. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew one thing for sure. Silence has fulfilled its purpose. And whatever comes after that will be the consequence. Ethan Carter didn't sleep. He closed his eyes, but his mind was perfectly alert. The steady hum of the airplane's engines didn't lull him to sleep as usual. It was like a background drumbeat, slow but persistent, reminding him that the flight was still going on, and so was the story. The silver tray had been cleared away. No one asked if he wanted to eat. No one apologized. Everything was handled so smoothly, as if that moment had never happened. But Ethan knew that some things don't disappear just because people pretend not to see them. He opened his eyes. The cabin lights had been dimmed. The first-class cabin was bathed in a pale blue light, making every face appear distant and cold. Mark Reynolds stood at the front, speaking softly to a flight attendant. She leaned towards him, whispering something. Ethan couldn't hear every word clearly, but he could clearly see the body language. The way Mark crossed his arms, the way he nodded, the way he glanced towards seat 1A, then turned away. Ethan felt neither a sense of victory nor relief. He only saw one thing gradually taking shape: a defense. He'd been in meetings like this hundreds of times. When people start to realize that a problem is no longer small, their first reaction isn't to fix it. It's about protecting yourself. Ethan turned on his phone. He didn't turn on the screen. He just quickly checked the small icon in the corner. The recording app is still running. He didn't do it out of doubt. He did it based on experience. He learned that when a story is told by only one person, it's easy for it to be distorted. But when the truth speaks for itself, things will be different. A female flight attendant approached seat 1A. Sir, she said, her voice low. Is there anything else we can assist you with? The question sounds perfectly standard. It's exactly what it sounds like. Ethan looked up. Yes, and no. I'd like to know why my pre-ordered meal was given to someone else. The flight attendant blinked. I'm not aware of that, knowing a. Must be a misunderstanding. Ethan nodded. Then I'd like to speak with the captain. The atmosphere around us changed instantly. The flight attendant took a slight step back. Sir no. The captain is busy flying the aircraft. Ethan looked at her. I'm aware and Noy. That's why I'm asking to speak with him when it's appropriate. A moment of silence. Then, she said something Ethan had heard before. Only not on an airplane. Sir, you need to return to your seat and remain calm. Ethan didn't change his posture. He didn't change his voice. I am calm, he replied. I'm asking a question. The flight attendant glanced at him one more time, then turned away faster than necessary. Ethan let out a sigh of relief. He began to sense that his boundaries were being tested. It's not his. It belongs to them. A few minutes later, Mark Reynolds returned. This time, his expression was completely different. No longer is there rigid politeness. Instead, there's a sternness cloaked in armor. Sir Mark Noy, I need you to lower your voice. Ethan looked around. The first-class cabin was quiet. No one spoke loudly. There was no noise. My voice is normal, Ethan Dapp. I'm simply asking for an explanation. Mark bent down and lowered his voice. We've already explained the situation in ta, Noe. At this point, you're being disruptive. The word echoed, like a hammer striking the air. Disruptive. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew the weight of that word. He had seen people labeled like that before. In the office, in the classroom, in the courtroom. One word, it can completely change the direction of a story. Ethan looked directly at Mark. Disruptive would imply, I'm causing a disturbance in Noy. I'm seated. I'm speaking calmly. I've followed every instruction. Mark pursed his lips. Sir, he said slowly. I don't want this to escalate. Ethan nodded. Neither do I in Noy. That's why I'm asking for transparency. The two looked at each other. There was no shouting, no violent gestures. But within that confined space, a silent battle was taking place. It's not between two individuals. It's between truth and petty power. Mark straightened his back. All right, Ainge Tanoi. I'm going to document this as passenger noncompliance. Ethan blinked. On what grounds on, Hoy? Mark didn't reply immediately. Refusal to accept crew instructions, he said afterward. Ethan felt his heart beat a little faster. It wasn't because he was panicking. It was because he understood very well the consequences of such words. He looked at Mark. Can you repeat that, he asked. Mark looked at him, then repeated this time more slowly. Refusal to comply. Ethan didn't immediately object. He looked down at his hands. Still open. Still resting on his lap. He recalled a board meeting from many years ago. At that time, a manager told him, Ethan, real power doesn't lie in how loud you speak. It lies in your ability to remain calm when others lose their temper. Ethan looked up. Mark, he said, calling him by his name for the first time. I have complied with every instruction given. Mark didn't answer. I was seated. I lowered my tray. I did not raise my voice. I did not leave my seat. Mark swallowed. And yet in Ta-Noi you continue to challenge the crew. Ethan nodded. Yes, and Noi. I'm challenging a decision, not authority. A moment of silence ensued. Then, Mark said something that crossed an invisible line. If you continue on to Noi, we may have to involve the captain and authorities upon landing. Authorities. That word shouldn't be spoken loudly. But it's heavy. It weighs heavily like a threat wrapped in a procedural facade. Ethan felt his throat dry up. It wasn't because he was afraid for himself. It was because he knew that for many people, just hearing that would be enough to silence them. He thought of those who had no lawyer, no status, no one to call. He thought of his mother. Of the words she said years ago, he exhaled. Then he spoke very slowly. I would like that noted as well, Ann H. Noe. That I was threatened with authorities for asking a question. Mark looked at him. In his eyes, Ethan caught a glimpse of something akin to hesitation. But it disappeared very quickly. Very well, Mark Noy. Please, remain seated. He turned away. Ethan sat still. He neither won nor lost. But he knew a door had just been opened. It's not a door to reconciliation. It's a door to consequences. He looked out the window. Outside, the sky was pitch black. It had stopped raining. Only scattered stars very far away could be seen. He wondered, not with anger, but with a very human calmness, if I weren't myself, where would this all lead? He doesn't have an answer. But he knew that the next part of this flight wouldn't be peaceful anymore. After Mark Reynolds turned away, the first-class cabin fell into an unusual silence. It wasn't the pleasant silence of people resting. It was a heavy silence. As if the air in the cabin had thickened, slowed down, and become heavier. Ethan Carter remained seated upright in seat 1A. He didn't move. He didn't look at Mark. He didn't look around for a supportive gaze. He knew very well that at times like these the silence of the majority was not a protest, but a form of self-protection. He doesn't blame them. Everyone on this flight has their own journey. A meeting to attend on time, a family waiting, a child at home. No one wants to be dragged into a story they have no control over. Ethan understands that better than anyone. He leaned his head back slightly in his chair. He closed his eyes just for a few seconds, not to rest, but to reorganize my thoughts. In his mind, the pieces began to fit together. Not the meal, not the silver platter, not the champagne that was overlooked. It's a series of behaviors, fleeting glances, unfinished sentences, carefully chosen words, aggressive, disruptive, noncompliance. Ethan had seen those words somewhere before, in HR emails, in disciplinary reports, in files where just one line is enough to halt an entire career. He opened his eyes. In the front, Mark Reynolds was standing next to another flight attendant. This time it was an older, shorter man with graying hair. They spoke very softly, but Mark kept glancing towards seat 1A. Ethan could guess the content without even listening. He was used to these kinds of exchanges. Exchanges where the question was no longer right or wrong, but how will we record it? A flight attendant walked past, bent down, and picked up an empty glass from seat 2B. She didn't look at Ethan, as if seat 1A didn't exist. Ethan took a deep breath. He wondered not for the first time in his life. If I stand up right now, will things get worse? He knows the answer. Have. And that's why he didn't stand up. He chose to stay still. He chose to remain silent. He chose to let things continue to unfold. About 15 minutes passed. Then the captain's voice came through the loudspeaker. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 37,000 feet. His voice was deep, slow, and full of confidence. Ethan listened. It wasn't because of the weather forecast. It was because he knew that this voice, sooner or later, it would be related to him. When the announcement ended, Mark Reynolds turned around. This time, he didn't bend down. He stood straight, slightly blocking the way. Sir, Mark Noy, I need to inform you of something. Ethan looked up. Go ahead, he replied. Mark glanced around the compartment, as if to make sure no one was too close. Based on your continued refusal to accept crew instructions, Mark Noy, we've documented this as a potential security concern. Ethan didn't react immediately. He let the thought die down. Security concern? He asked again very softly. Mark nodded. Yes, sir. Ethan tilted his head. Can you explain how I pose a security concern, Hoy? Mark swallowed. You've repeatedly challenged crew authority Ange Tanoy, and that can be interpreted as noncompliance. Ethan nodded slowly. Let me make sure I understand in Noy. I remained seated. I spoke calmly. I followed all instructions, and that's being interpreted as noncompliance. Mark didn't answer directly. Sir, he said, his voice harsher. I'm advising you to stop engaging with the crew. Ethan looked Mark straight in the eye. Am I being ordered to remain silent on Hoy? Mark hesitated. I'm advising you, he repeated. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Then I'll remain seated Noy. And I'll also remain silent. Mark nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. He turned away. Ethan watched. In that moment, he felt very clearly that something had been reversed. It's not about power. It's about role. From this moment on, he was no longer considered a passenger. He is being seen as a risk. Ethan didn't panic. He just felt sad. I'm not sad for myself. I'm sad for the system I'm about to be responsible for. He looked down at his phone. The battery was at over 30%. He opened a message. He didn't send it right away. Just type a few lines. On Flight 728. Situation escalating. Possible crew misconduct. Stand by. He didn't write down anyone's name. He didn't provide any details. Just a short announcement, enough time to prepare. He locked the screen. The first-class cabin remained silent. Some passengers were asleep. Some were wearing headphones. Only one elderly woman in the second row, near the aisle, occasionally glanced in Ethan's direction. Her gaze was neither curious nor judgmental, just worried. Ethan met her gaze. He nodded slightly, as if to reassure her. She smiled very slightly. Then, she turned away. That moment warmed Ethan's heart more than any words could express. Time passes slowly, very slow. Then another flight attendant approached seat 1A. Sir Noe, please keep your seatbelt fastened. Ethan looked down. His seatbelt had been fastened a long time ago. It is, he replied. She didn't apologize. She just nodded and left. Ethan understood. This is no longer a reminder. This is creating a profile. Every interaction, every word, every glance, he's being filmed, and he knew very well that files like these rarely benefited the person being targeted. He wondered not in panic, but with a cold, detached composure. If they decide to go further, what will I do? He had no intention of causing trouble, no intention of resisting, but he also had no intention of letting this story be told from only one side. Ethan leaned his head back. He didn't know exactly what would happen next, but he knew one thing. When someone is labeled the problem, the truth is often the first thing overlooked, and in the next part of this flight, the truth will be put to the test. Very powerful, the first-class cabin was enveloped in an unusual silence. It wasn't the quiet of sleep. It was a tense, strained silence, like a string stretched too far waiting for the slightest touch to snap. Ethan Carter remains in seat 1A. Keep your back straight. Place your hands still on your thighs. Look out the window. He no longer looked at his watch. He no longer counted the time. Because at this point, time is no longer the deciding factor in what will happen. People are the deciding factor. A flight attendant walked past, then turned around very quickly. She leaned down close to Ethan's ear, her voice a cold whisper. Sir, please remain seated and refrain from further communication with the crew. Ethan turned to look at her. Am I being instructed not to speak in Hoy? She avoided his gaze. I'm advising you, she said, repeating the exact phrase Mark Reynolds had used earlier. Advising. A very safe word. Not a command, but enough to create pressure. Ethan nodded. Understood, he said. She left faster than she arrived. Ethan leaned back in his chair. In his mind, a thought began to become clearer than ever. They don't want to solve the problem. They want to silence the voices. He had witnessed this before in the business world. When an issue is pushed too far, when someone starts to fear that the truth will have consequences, the first reaction isn't to correct the mistake, it's to reverse the story. And reversing the story always requires a villain. Ethan knew very well that at this moment that role was being offered to him. About 10 minutes later, Mark Reynolds returned. This time, he wasn't going alone. Accompanying Mark was a tall, broad-shouldered man, wearing a white shirt with epaulets. A small name tag on his chest read Captain Daniel Wright. Captain. His arrival caused a slight stir in the first-class cabin. A few passengers opened their eyes. A few removed their headphones. No one said anything, but all eyes were on seat 1A. Ethan looked up. Captain Wright stood in the doorway, looking down at him. Sir, he said, his voice low and clear. I'm being informed of a situation involving you. Ethan nodded. Yes, Captain. Captain Wright folded his arms. My crew reports that you've been confrontational, Ong Noi, and that you're refusing to comply with instructions. Ethan remained silent for a moment. It's not because there's nothing to say. It's because he knows that timing is more important than content. Captain Ange Noi Sao Do Jiong Deo. I've remained seated the entire time. I've followed every instruction given. I asked for an explanation regarding my pre-ordered meal. Captain Wright looked at him. His gaze wasn't angry, but it wasn't open either. Sir Ong Noi, when a passenger challenges the crew repeatedly, that becomes a security issue. Security issue. This time, the word was no longer spoken in a roundabout way. It was placed directly on the table. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. It's not fear. It's a very clear understanding. He is standing on a line that many have been pushed across, simply because they didn't remain silent at the right time. May I ask, Ethan Noi Chumray, what specific action of mine constitutes a security risk? Captain Wright did not answer immediately. He looked over at Mark Reynolds. Mark nodded slightly. He's been argumentative, Mark Noi. He raised his voice earlier. Ethan Quay saying, Mark, did I raise my voice? He asked. Mark avoided his gaze. Captain Wright raised his hand, signaling to stop. Sir Ong Noi, I don't want this to escalate any further. Ethan nodded. Neither do I, and Dap. That's why I'm asking for clarity. A moment of silence ensued. Nobody said anything. In the first-class cabin, the air was so heavy that it seemed like everyone was holding their breath. Captain Wright exhaled. Here's what's going to happen, Ong Noi. You're going to remain seated. You will not engage with the crew. And upon landing, authorities may meet the aircraft to address this. Authorities. No more maybe. No more consider. The threat has now become a script. Ethan didn't react immediately. He looked up at the captain's face. No anger. no defiance. It's simply a calmness that makes the other person uncomfortable. Captain Ethan Noy, I would like to be clear on the record. Captain Wright looked at him. I have not threatened anyone. I have not left my seat. I have not used aggressive language. And I have not refused any lawful instruction. Captain Wright, I am Long, Ethan continued. If authorities are involved, I welcome that ainge noe, but I want it documented that I'm requesting this for my own protection as well. Mark Reynolds was startled. Captain Wright frowned. For your protection, he asked. Yes, Ethan Dapp, because at this point my concern is not the meal. It's the narrative being created. A few passengers exchanged glances. The older woman in the second row gripped the armrest of her seat tightly. Captain Wright looked at Ethan for a few more seconds. Then he nodded. Very well, Ong Noi. We'll handle it on the ground. He turned to Mark. Monitor the situation, Ong Noi. If he does anything else, notify me immediately. Mark nodded quickly. Captain Wright turned away. His footsteps echoed, then faded away behind the cockpit door. The first-class cabin fell silent again. But it was no longer the initial silence. It is the silence of waiting. Ethan leaned back in his chair. He could feel his heartbeat very clearly. Not fast, not erratic, just uniform, very uniform. He knew that from this moment on, everything he said, every movement he made, could be interpreted in the most unfavorable way. He also knows that many people in this situation have chosen one of two ways, either resist or collapse. Ethan didn't choose either option. He chose to be present. He took out his phone. He opened a pre-written message. Crew escalation. Captain involved. Authorities mentioned. Landing SFO. Be ready. He didn't send any more details. That's not necessary. The people on the other end of the line will understand. He locked the screen. Outside the window, the distant city lights began to appear. San Francisco was ahead. But for Ethan, the real destination of this flight wasn't at the airport. It's in the moment the airplane door opens. And in the next part of the story, things will go beyond words. The cabin lights were turned up one notch brighter. Not the dazzling light of joy upon landing. Instead, a cold white light illuminated each face in the first-class cabin. Ethan Carter realized that even before the announcement was made, the plane began to descend, a slight sensation in my ears. A small tremor as the fuselage adjusted its direction. Then Captain Daniel Wright's voice came through the loudspeaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into San Francisco. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. A pause. His voice changed very slightly, not loudly, but enough for those familiar with his voice to notice. Additionally, due to a situation involving a passenger, we ask that everyone remain seated upon landing until authorities have boarded the aircraft. The first-class compartment froze solid. A few passengers turned to look at each other. Some looked up, taking off their headphones. A few glances quickly swept across the screen, then settled on seat 1A. Ethan didn't move. He had been waiting for this statement for over an hour. Not with fear, but with a heavy feeling in my chest. Situation involving a passenger. No name, no description. But in that enclosed space, everyone understood who they were talking about. Mark Reynolds appeared at the front of the cabin. He stood blocking the aisle, his hands clasped in front of his chest. His gaze no longer held hesitation. Only a cold certainty remained. Ethan looked straight ahead. He placed his hands on his thighs, open, not clenched. He knew that from this moment on, every move could be interpreted. The elderly woman in the second row looked at Ethan. Her lips moved as if she wanted to say something. Then, she fell silent. Ethan nodded very slightly at her. Not to reassure him, but to say that he understands. The plane touched down. The sound of the wheels scraping against the runway was sharp and prolonged. There was a stronger vibration than usual. There was no applause. There was only a prolonged silence. The plane didn't taxi straight to the gate. It turned left, slowed down. Through the window, Ethan saw flashing green and red lights. An airport vehicle, then too. His heart beat a little faster. It wasn't because he was afraid. It was because he knew the script was being executed. The plane came to a complete stop. The seatbelts were unfastened. But no one got up. The front door opened. Not a flight attendant. Not a jet bridge. They were two airport security officers. Following them were two local police officers. The sound of their shoes hitting the floor was heavy and decisive. Captain Wright stepped out of the cockpit. He stood straight and adjusted his collar. Then he pointed. Seat 1A, he said. No names. Just the location. Two police officers stepped forward. The first-class cabin was filled with a sense of anticipation. Ethan looked up slowly. Officer Onoi Jeong Bin Ten. Before anything happens, I'd like to state that I've complied with all instructions. A police officer looked at him. He didn't answer. Sir, the other man said, please stand up. Ethan stood up, slowly, clearly. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. Mark Reynolds stood right in front, his eyes following every move. Turn around, the police officer said. Ethan turned his back. He felt the cold metal touch his wrist. Click, then click. The sound was very faint. But in Ethan's head, it sounded like a hammer pounding. Handcuff. At that moment, the entire first-class cabin fell silent. The man in the blue suit in seat 1B bowed his head. He didn't look. The elderly woman in the second row stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice trembling but clear. He hasn't done anything. Mark Reynolds turned to her. Ma'am, please remain seated, he said sharply. This is a security matter. Security. It's that word again. Ethan stood still. No jerking of his arm. No reaction. He looked straight ahead. A police officer grabbed his elbow. Let's go, the person said. Ethan walked away. Each step felt heavier. It wasn't because of the handcuffs. It was because of the stairs around us. Their eyes glanced at him, then quickly turned away. No one wants to remember the face of a problem. As they led him through the passageway, Ethan overheard Mark Reynolds whispering to Captain Wright. He was uncooperative. Mark Noy refused to comply. Captain Wright nodded. Make sure it's documented. Documented. A single word. But enough to rewrite an entire story. Ethan was led down the stairs. The cold San Francisco evening wind whipped against his face. The smell of fuel. The smell of metal. At the bottom of the stairs, two police cars were parked. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the aircraft's fuselage. Ethan paused for a second. A police officer pulled him along. Keep moving. Ethan said nothing. In that moment, a thought flashed through his mind. If I'm not myself, then this will be the end. He knew many people didn't get a sequel. No chance to explain. No one waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He was led toward a car. The back door opened. Get in. Ethan bowed his head, preparing to enter. Wait. A voice rang out from behind. Not a police voice. Not an airport voice. A deep, resolute male voice. Ethan looked up. A black SUV was parked not far away. The door was open. A man in a dark suit walked out. He was followed by two others. The man leading the way approached. He raised his hand. Officer, he said, his voice calm but authoritative. I wouldn't do that. The police returned. Who are you? Someone asked. The man showed his card. My name is James Holloway in Tannoy. I'm legal counsel for Ethan Carter. The air felt like it had been sucked dry. The police officer looked at the ID card. Then, he looked at Ethan. James Holloway took another step. And the man you're detaining, NH Noy Teep, is the CEO of Carter Holloway Group. A moment of silence. Ethan stood still. The handcuffs were still on his wrists. The policeman blinked. CEO, someone asked again. James nodded. And, as of 48 hours ago, Ainge, Noy, the controlling owner of the airline you just flew. The color on Captain Wright's face disappeared. Mark Reynolds stood frozen on the stairs. The police officers looked at each other. A man bent down and unlocked the handcuffs. Click. The metal detached from Ethan's wrist. He gently rubbed his wrist. No need to rush. James Holloway Quay, sang Ethan. Sorry we're late, he said softly. Traffic. Ethan nodded slightly. It's all right, he replied. He turned around and looked up the stairs, where Captain Wright and Mark Reynolds were standing. For the first time since boarding the plane, Ethan Carter smiled. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It was the smile of someone who had just been through rock bottom. He turned to the police. Officer, he said, his voice very soft. I'd like to walk back onto my plane. The policeman swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Ethan turned around and went up the stairs. Each step now no longer feels heavy. Ethan Carter climbed the metal staircase step by step. No more whistling wind in my ears. No more flashing red and green lights behind me. Only the sound of his own footsteps remained. Slow, clear, steady. James Holloway walked beside him, maintaining just the right distance. Not too close, not too far back. As those who have worked together for many years understand, there are moments when one person needs to move on alone. As Ethan stepped through the airplane door, the first-class cabin came into view. Nothing has changed physically. The leather seats are still the same. The lighting is still the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. The remaining passengers all looked up. Some opened their mouths as if to say something. Others immediately lowered their heads. Captain Daniel Wright is standing near the cockpit door. He no longer stood as straight as before. His shoulders were slightly slumped. His hands clenched and then relaxed. Mark Reynolds stood behind him close to the wall. His face was pale. He didn't dare look Ethan in the eye. That moment lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for everyone in the cabin to understand that the roles have been reversed. Ethan didn't say anything right away. He took a few more steps into the compartment. He stopped at the center aisle. James Holloway stepped back half a step behind him. Two airport police officers also stood behind silently. No one gave orders. No one directed. Silence itself forms a barrier. Ethan took a deep breath. He felt no sense of victory. No schadenfreude. No anger. It's just a very human feeling. It's the feeling of someone who has just been pushed out of their dignity and then reclaimed it through their own composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was loud enough to fill the enclosed space. "I apologize for the delay and for what everyone has just witnessed." Nobody said anything. "My name is Ethan Carter," he continued. "I am the passenger in seat 1A on this flight." A pause. "And I am also the CEO of Carter Holloway Group." A few soft gasps could be heard. Ethan didn't look at Mark. He didn't look at Captain Wright. He looked straight into the compartment. "I boarded this flight as an ordinary passenger," he said. "I wasn't wearing a suit. I wasn't introducing myself. I wasn't expecting any special privileges." He stopped. "I just want to be treated fairly for what I paid for." The silence grew heavier. Ethan turned his head and looked towards Captain Wright. "Captain Wright," he said, calling out the name clearly. The captain was startled. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice hoarse. Ethan didn't approach. He didn't need to. "He gave permission to escort me off the plane," Ethan said, "based on reports that I was a security threat." Captain Wright swallowed. "Yes," he said softly. "That's correct." Ethan nodded. "I want to ask," he said, "do you have any evidence that I threatened anyone?" "Captain Wright, I am long. Do you have any records indicating that I left my seat, spoke loudly, or refused to comply with safety instructions?" No reply. Ethan Quay saying Mark Reynolds. "Mark," he said. Mark jumped as if his name had been called in class. "Yes, Mr. Carter," he replied. Ethan looked him straight in the eye. "You told me to refuse to comply," Ethan said. "Can you specify what I refused to comply with?" Mark opened his mouth. Then it closed again. James Holloway took half a step forward. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm, "we have requested all logs, audio, and cabin interaction records for this flight." Captain Wright looked up. "Audio records?" he asked. James nodded. "Yes," he said. "This aircraft is equipped with an internal recording system for safety and training purposes." Mark Reynolds turned pale. James continued without rushing. "And we also have individual recordings," he said, "starting from the moment the meal is served." A very faint murmur spread through the compartment. Ethan remained standing still. "Mark," he said, his voice no louder than before. "Do you remember what you said when we were standing in the galley?" Mark looked down at the floor. "Do you remember saying that I was argumentative and non-compliant?" No reply. Ethan nodded. "It's all right," he said. "We'll listen again." Captain Wright raised his hand as if to say something. "Mr. Carter," he said hastily, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." Ethan turned to look at him. "Captain," he said, "I was publicly handcuffed. I think it's reasonable to clarify things in front of those who witnessed it." A moment of silence. The older woman in row 2 stands up. "He did nothing wrong," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I've been sitting here the whole time. I saw everything." Another passenger nodded, then another. Captain Wright looked around. He realized something he hadn't noticed before. The story is no longer in his hands. Ethan turned to look at the compartment. I'm not standing here to embarrass anyone, he said. Nor do I want to ruin anyone's career. Mark Reynolds looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Ethan looked at him. But I cannot accept that small powers are used to harm others, he said. And when questioned, it is masked by words like security. James Holloway handed Ethan a thin file. Mr. Carter, he whispered. Ethan opened the file. He didn't read aloud. He just looked. Then it closed. Captain Wright, Ethan said from this moment on, he is no longer the commander of this flight. The first-class cabin was shaken. Captain Wright's eyes widened. What he exclaimed. James Holloway stepped forward. Daniel Wright, he said using his full name, the aircraft you're standing on, is owned by a subsidiary of the Carter-Holloway Group. Captain Wright took a half-step back. And due to gross misconduct, James Noetiep, you are hereby relieved of duty pending investigation. Mark Reynolds let out a sigh. Mark Reynolds, Ethan said. Mark trembled. Yes, sir, me too, Ethan said. Effective immediately. There was no anger. There was no triumph. It's just a clear statement. Ethan turned to look at the compartment. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, we will arrange a backup flight crew to complete the flight. Some people breathed a sigh of relief. Ethan looked down at his wrists. The red marks from the handcuffs were still there. He stroked her gently. Then he spoke, his voice lowering. What just happened isn't just my story, he said. It's the story of so many people who have been told to be quiet just because they dared to ask questions. He stopped. Thank you to everyone who witnessed it. Thank you to everyone who didn't turn away. Ethan walked towards seat 1A. Sit down. This time, no one in first class doubted that he belonged there. The first-class cabin is no longer noisy. But the silence was no longer as heavy and oppressive as before. It was a different kind of silence. The silence of people who had just witnessed something that went beyond the ordinary experience of a flight. Ethan Carter is seated in seat 1A. The chair back is still soft. The lighting is still gentle. But the feeling in his heart was completely different from when he first boarded the plane. No more tension. No more tightness. All that remains is a very deep, very human weariness. James Holloway stood in the aisle speaking softly to two police officers. They nodded, then stepped back a few paces, keeping their distance. Captain Daniel Wright and Mark Reynolds were no longer there. They had been asked to leave the compartment silently, without saying another word. There was no applause. No one celebrated. Ethan doesn't want that. He didn't come here to be celebrated. Nor does he need a crowd to confirm that he's right. He just needs everything to stop where it happened. A young flight attendant with a youthful face stood at the front of the cabin. She looked flustered, her hands clasped together. Mr. Carter, she said softly. We, the backup flight crew, will arrive in about 20 minutes. Ethan nodded. Thank you, he replied. She bowed her head very slightly, then turned away. Ethan watched. He wondered, not with reproach, but with the observation of someone about to shoulder a much greater responsibility. How many of them have witnessed things like this and chosen to remain silent because they had no other choice? He thought of himself many years ago, when he didn't have a lawyer standing at the bottom of the stairs, when he didn't have the right to stop a flight, when he was just a black man in a hoodie trying to get from point A to point B. James Holloway turned around and sat down in the chair opposite Ethan. Are you okay? James asked. Ethan thought for a second. Not exactly, he said. But I'll be fine. James nodded. He understood the answer. The PR team is calling, James continued. They want to know if we should release a statement right away. Ethan shook his head. Not yet, he said. It's not the right time. James tilted his head. Are you sure? This story will spread very quickly. Ethan looked out the window. Outside SFO Airport was brightly lit. Another plane took off. Life went on. That's why Ethan said slowly, I don't want it to become a performance. James remained silent, waiting for him to continue. If I were to turn this into a personal victory, Ethan said, then it would end there. He turned to look at James. But if I consider this a systemic problem, he continued, then this story makes sense. James nodded very slightly. So what's the next step, he asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his wrist. The red mark was still there. It didn't hurt, but it was enough to remind him. I want the entire airline leadership team here, Ethan said. Not tomorrow. Not next week. James frowned. Tonight, Ethan replied. James thought quickly. Okay, I'll arrange it. Ethan leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes for a few seconds. In his mind, the recent images didn't replay like a film. They appeared disjointed, in fragments. The sound of handcuffs, the voice saying security issue, the gaze of the elderly woman, and there's a question he's been avoiding all this time. If I use this power, will I become the very thing I once hated? Ethan opened his eyes. James was looking at him as if he could read his thoughts. I'm not one of them, James said softly. I know that. Ethan smiled very slightly. Power doesn't make people bad, he said. It just reveals what kind of people they really are. A moment of silence. Then Ethan stood up. He didn't stand up to give orders. He stood up to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, turning toward the compartment. All eyes turned to him again. I know everyone has experienced a flight that wasn't like any other, he said. And I know that wasn't pleasant. He stopped. I don't expect people to understand or forgive, he said. I just hope people remember. Some people nodded. Some people listened very attentively. What just happened wasn't an accident, Ethan said. It's the result of small decisions, repeated over and over again. He looked around. If I remain silent tonight, he said, then tomorrow someone else will sit in that chair. He didn't just sit in seat 1A. He didn't need to. And it's possible, he continued, that person won't have a chance to come back. The first-class cabin was eerily silent. Ethan nodded slightly as if to say thank you. He sat down. James exhaled. You said that without a single word of anger, James said. Not everyone can do that. Ethan shrugged. Anger is easy, he said. Responsibility is not. About 15 minutes later, the airplane door opened again. A new flight crew boarded. They looked professional. Their eyes were serious. The leader was a middle-aged woman, with her hair neatly tied up, her name tag reading Laura Mitchell, operations manager. She looked around the compartment, then her gaze settled on Ethan. Mr. Carter, she said. I'm Laura Mitchell. I'm in charge of running the area. Ethan stood up and shook her hand. Thank you for arriving so quickly, he said. Laura looked him straight in the eyes. No, she replied. Thank you for stopping this flight. Ethan was a little surprised. Aren't you surprised? He asked. Laura shook her head. I've received complaints, she said, many times. But never before. As clear as this. Ethan nodded. I don't want those 3 people to become scapegoats, he said. I want to know how long ago this happened. Laura exhaled. It's been longer than we'd like to admit, she said. A moment of silence. Well then, Ethan said, we'll start tonight. Laura looked at him, her eyes resolute. Yes, she said. From tonight. Ethan sat back down in seat 1A. For the first time since boarding the plane, he felt this flight was going in the right direction. Not geographically, but from a human perspective. The first-class cabin is now quiet again. No more police. No more tense stares. No more whispering. All that remained was the familiar, steady sound of the engine, like the deep breathing of a body recovering from shock. Ethan Carter sat in seat 1A, his hands resting on the armrests, feeling the cool leather beneath his fingertips. This sensation was quite different from the beginning of the flight. Back then, this chair felt like a place where he had to prove himself worthy. But now, it's simply a chair. James Holloway sat opposite, opened his laptop, and quickly scanned through a series of recently arrived emails. The news is starting to spread, James whispered. At least 3 passengers have posted videos. Nobody knows the whole story yet, but it will be soon. Ethan nodded. Let them talk, he replied. The truth doesn't need us to promote it. James looked at him, tilting his head slightly. You know, he said, most people in your position would have chosen a different path. Ethan didn't look at James. He looked out the window. Which way? He asked. James shrugged slightly. Demand heads. Press conferences, lawsuits. Make a big fuss about it. Ethan was silent for a moment. Making noise is easy, he said. But it doesn't fix anything. James nodded. At the front of the cabin, Laura Mitchell stood with the new flight crew. She spoke softly, but her voice was clear and decisive. The way she stood, the way she listened, gave Ethan a sense of familiarity. That's the feeling you get when you know the person in front of you understands their responsibilities. Laura turned around and walked towards Ethan. Mr. Carter, she said. We've done a quick review of our internal records. Ethan stood up and gestured for her to sit in the empty chair next to him. What did you discover? He asked. Laura exhaled. It's not about one flight, she said. It's not about one crew. Ethan nodded. He had guessed it. There have been reports, Laura continued. Complaints. Emails. But they're being categorized as minor service issues. Ethan smiled very slightly. Minor issues, he reiterated. Yes, Laura replied. Until they add up. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Do you know what the scariest thing is? He asked. Laura looked at him. It's not that these things happen, Ethan said. It's that people have gotten used to them. Laura remained silent. We can't fix a system, Ethan continued, if the people in it no longer feel it's worth fixing. James closed his laptop. So, what are you going to do? He asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked around the compartment. The passengers were still sitting there. Some were chatting quietly. Some were resting with their eyes closed. Life goes on, as if nothing happened. But Ethan knew that there were moments, if he didn't seize them, they wouldn't come back again. He stood up. Laura, he said, I want to hold a meeting. Laura nodded. I was mentally prepared for that, she said. This isn't a press conference, Ethan said. This isn't a board meeting. Laura was a little surprised. So, it was a conversation, Ethan replied. Between me and the people who work here. James frowned. Do you want to speak to a flight attendant? He asked. To everyone, Ethan said. To everyone who's at this airport tonight. If they want to. Laura thought quickly. That's not in any of the procedures, she said. Ethan smiled. I know, he replied. But what just happened wasn't in the procedure either. A moment of silence. Laura nodded slowly. Okay, she said. I'll make the arrangements. About 30 minutes later, the airplane door opened. Not to pick up passengers. To pick up a group of people. Flight attendants. Ground staff. A few shift managers. They were huddled together in the area in front of the compartment. No neat uniforms. No solemn postures. They were just people who had finished their shifts and were called back for some unclear reason. Ethan stood in front of them. No podium. No microphone. He stands alongside me. I won't keep you here long, he said. And I'm not here to scold you. A few eyes looked up. I just want to ask one question, Ethan continued. And I expect an honest answer. He stopped. How many of you have ever seen a passenger treated unfairly? A few hands went up. Then a few more hands followed. No one raised their hand very high. It was as if they were still hesitating. Ethan nodded. How many people have wanted to say something but didn't say it? More hands. A young flight attendant bites her lip. A ground staff member looks down. Ethan inhaled. And how many people, he said slowly, have ever thought, I don't have the power to change this? Almost all of them. No one spoke. But their eyes answered. Ethan looked at them. You're not wrong, he said. This system has made you believe that. He paused, allowing his words time to reach each person. But starting today, he continued, I want you all to know one thing. He placed his hand on his chest. If you see something wrong, and you speak up, you are not alone. A few people looked up. I don't promise things will be easy, Ethan said. But I promise you won't be punished for choosing the right thing. Laura Mitchell stood beside them, silently observing. James Holloway looked around, noticing something was changing. Quiet. Not explosive. But it's very real. An older flight attendant stepped forward. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice trembling slightly. We've become accustomed to silence. Ethan nodded. I know, he said. And I don't blame you. She looked at him, her eyes reddening. But tonight, she said for the first time, I feel I can speak out. Ethan smiled. Well, then he said that's where we begin. The meeting ended without applause. No one chanted slogans. Everyone dispersed very quietly. But as they left, Ethan saw what he had been hoping for. Some people stood straighter. Some eyes shone brighter. It's not because they believe everything is fixed. Because they believe that someone is listening. Ethan returned to seat 1A. He sat down. James let out a long sigh. You know, James said nobody's going to write about this talk. Ethan nodded. That's all right, he replied. Real changes rarely make the headlines. He looked out the window. The night in San Francisco was deep, but somewhere within him a morning was beginning. Mornings in San Francisco arrive very slowly. It wasn't because the sun rose late. It was because the night before was too long. Ethan Carter left the airport while the city was still shrouded in mist. The highway was sparsely populated. Glass buildings reflected the pale yellow light of the early morning. He sat in the back seat of the car silently. James Holloway sat beside him, his phone vibrating incessantly. Text messages, missed calls, emails. I think we've officially entered the no-turning-back phase, James said, his voice tired but alert. Ethan smiled very slightly. We went in there the moment the plane landed, he replied. James quickly scanned a headline. The video from the first-class cabin has leaked, he said. I don't know the whole thing, but the part where you're handcuffed. It's everywhere. Ethan looked out the window. He didn't ask any further questions. No need. He knows how the world works. A moment cut out of context. An image shocking enough, and millions will fill in the rest with their own emotions. The PR team wants to see you right away, James continued. They think you should release a statement soon. Take control of the narrative. Ethan thought for a few seconds. No, he said. We don't control the story. James turned to look at him. So what do you want to do? Ethan exhaled slowly. We let the truth find its way. James was silent. Then he nodded. Okay, he said. But you should know. When a story no longer belongs to one person, it becomes unpredictable. Ethan nodded. I know, he replied. But it's also become stronger. That afternoon, in a small cafe near the Carter Holloway Group's temporary office, Ethan sat alone in a corner. No suit. No tie. Just a simple shirt. The waiter brought the coffee and placed it on the table. Here you go, she said, smiling. Thank you, Ethan replied. It was just a very ordinary moment. But it made him stop in his tracks. No scrutinizing glances. No suspicion. No unspoken questions. It's simply one person serving another. Ethan took a sip of coffee. The familiar question resurfaced in his mind. Things should always have been like this. Why isn't it? The phone vibrates. A message from an unknown number. Mr. Carter, I was the passenger in row 3 on yesterday's flight. I just wanted to say, thank you for not staying silent. Ethan finished reading. He didn't reply immediately. Then another message. I'm a flight attendant for another airline. I cried when I watched the video. Because I've seen something like that before. And I didn't dare speak up. Then there's another piece of news. I'm a father. My son asked why that man was handcuffed. I didn't know how to answer. But I know, thanks to you, I will answer differently. Ethan put the phone down. He didn't see himself as a hero. Nor did he see himself shouldering a great mission. He only saw stories he had never heard before. And that both warmed his heart and weighed heavily on him. That afternoon, an emergency meeting was convened at the airline's temporary headquarters in San Francisco. No press, no cameras. Only senior management was present. Laura Mitchell, James Holloway, and Ethan Carter. The atmosphere in the meeting room was tense, but not chaotic. The media situation is heating up by the hour, one executive said. They're digging up old issues. Laura nodded. They're not just digging, she said. They're connecting. Ethan sat still, listening. There's a common denominator, Laura continued. Not all of it is outright racism, but there's one thing they all have in common. Little power, Ethan said. Laura looked at him. Yes, she replied, and the lack of supervision. Another manager chimed in. We need to issue an apology, he said, and emphasized that this was an isolated incident. Ethan looked up. No, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. If we call it exceptional, Ethan continued, then we're lying. The room was silent. And I didn't buy this company, he said, to continue lying. James Holloway leaned back in his chair, observing. Laura nodded slowly. So what do you propose? She asked. Ethan stood up. He walked to the glass whiteboard in the conference room. We're going to do 3 things, he said. He wrote number 1. 1. Transparency. He turned around. All complaint data relating to the treatment of passengers, he said, will be independently reviewed. Some people whispered. No selection, Ethan added. No beautification. He wrote the number 2. 2. Responsibility. It wasn't just individuals, he said, but management also ignored or covered it up. Laura inhaled. That will hurt, she said. Ethan nodded. Real change always hurts, he replied. He wrote the number 3. Part 3. Culture. We don't just train skills, Ethan said. We train how to see people. A manager frowned. Are you talking about bias training? Ethan shook his head. It's not just about the course, he said. It's about how we respond when someone speaks up. He turned around and looked around the room. If a young flight attendant knows that telling the truth won't cost them their job, he said, then they will tell it. No one objected. No one voiced their agreement. But Ethan saw something more important. No one turned away. That evening, Ethan returned to the hotel. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at himself. Not the CEO's face. Not the face of someone who just appeared in the news. He was just a black man in his 40s with slightly tired eyes. He recalled the moment he was handcuffed, not with bitterness, and with an unusual level of alertness. If I didn't have power, he thought I would have become just a number in the statistics. He washed his face. Cold water. He looked in the mirror again. Then he said to himself, I mustn't waste this power. The phone vibrates. James Holloway. The board wants to see you tomorrow morning, James said. They're under a lot of pressure. Ethan exhaled. I guess so, he said. Are you ready? James asked. Ethan was silent for a few seconds. Then he replied. I was never ready, he said. But I won't back down. James chuckled softly. That's good, he said. Because from now on, this story is no longer just yours. Ethan put the phone down. He sat on the bed, looking out at the city at night. The car lights cast long streaks of light. Life doesn't stand still, and he knew that what he did next would affect many people he had never met. Not everyone will agree. Not everyone will understand. But there's one thing he's sure of. Silence is no longer an option. The morning in San Francisco was colder than Ethan Carter had expected. It wasn't the cold of the weather. It was the cold of the 17th floor meeting room, where the white lights shone directly down on the long glass table. Ethan walked in with James Holloway. No one stood up. No one smiled. 12 people sat around the table. The familiar faces of the board of directors. People accustomed to making decisions without being questioned. Shall we begin? An older man asked. His name was Robert Langford, the interim chairman of the council. Ethan nodded and pulled up a chair to sit down. The air was thick and heavy. There was no small talk. No greetings. I think Langford said, his voice, even we all know the reason for this meeting. Ethan looked straight ahead. Yes, he said. And I also think we all know why it needs to happen. A few pairs of eyes met. Langford clasped his hands together in front of his chest. Mr. Carter, he said, what happened on the flight was unfortunate. Ethan didn't react. But Langford continued, the way you handled the situation created significant risk for the company. James shifted slightly, but Ethan gestured for him to let him speak. What risks? Ethan asked. Langford tilted his head. The public, he said. The media. The shareholders. Ethan nodded slowly. He's worried that shareholders will react, he said. Because they know the truth. Langford pursed his lips. I'm worried they'll see this company getting out of control, he replied. Another person spoke up. Elaine Porter, in charge of finance. We received calls from 2 major investment funds, she said. They are unhappy with the internal workings being exposed like this. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Miss Elaine, he said, was the internal affair exposed? Or was the wrongdoing exposed? Elaine remained silent. Langford et al. We're not here to argue about semantics, he said. We're here to defend company values. Ethan leaned forward. So, I'd like to ask, he said, his voice low but clear, what are the core values of this company? A moment of silence. Langford replied. Safe. Professional. Service. Ethan nodded. And when a passenger is treated like a criminal, he said, when they haven't done anything wrong, which of those values are being protected? No one answered immediately. A younger man, Michael Reeves, chimed in. Ethan, he said, trying to keep his tone friendly, no one denies your feelings. But you need to understand, not every battle needs to be fought immediately. Ethan looked at Michael. You call that a battle? Ethan asked. Michael hesitated. I mean, we can handle it internally, he said. Quietly, effectively, without shaking the whole system. Ethan smiled slightly. Quietly, he repeated. Like how it's been handled? For years, Michael remained silent. Ethan sang Langford. Mr. Robert, he said. How long have you been here? 23 years. Langford replied somewhat sharply. Ethan nodded. So how many exceptional incidents did you see during that time, he asked. Langford did not reply. How many reports were put on hold? Ethan continued. How many emails went unanswered? James Holloway looked around and noticed that some people were starting to get annoyed. Langford tapped his hand lightly on the table. Enough, he said. You're turning this into an accusation. Ethan didn't back down. No, he said. I'm turning it into a confrontation. The room was completely silent. Ladies and gentlemen, Ethan said slowly, I didn't buy this company to keep things looking good. He paused, letting each word fall. I bought it to get it right. Elaine shook her head slightly. You're gambling too much, she said. Your reputation, your revenue, your market confidence. Ethan looked at her. What is market confidence built on? He asked. Silence or integrity? Elaine pursed her lips. Langford leaned back in his chair and sighed. You're the CEO, he said, but you don't own the entire company. Ethan nodded. I know, he replied, but I'm responsible for it. Another member, Thomas Green, spoke up. And what if the council doesn't agree with your proposed course of action? He asked. James Holloway tensed up. Ethan was silent for a few seconds. This was a moment he had mentally prepared for. If the council doesn't agree, Ethan said, then I will continue to do what I believe is right, until I'm no longer allowed to. A wave of murmurs. Langford looked at him, his eyes sharpening. Are you threatening to resign? Ethan shook his head. No, he said. I'm stating my position. He stood up. I will not sign any document, he said, that downplays responsibility, conceals data, or calls this an isolated incident. He looked at each person. If that makes me unsuitable for this position, he said, then, perhaps, the problem isn't with me. The room fell silent. James Holloway felt his heart racing. Langford stared at Ethan for a long time. Then he turned to the other members. We need to discuss this privately, he said. Ethan nodded. Of course, he replied. He turned and went to the door with James. As the door closed behind them, the long, empty corridor greeted them with soft yellow light. James breathed heavily. I just put everything on the table, he said. Are you all right? Ethan leaned against the wall. No, he said truthfully. But I don't regret it. James nodded. I've been doing this job long enough, he said, to know. Moments like these don't come around often. Ethan looked down at the floor. I've been silent too many times, he said. He looked up. Not this time. 20 minutes felt like 20 years. Finally, the meeting room door opened. Langford stepped out, his face no longer as stern as before. Mr. Carter, he said, the council will not stand in the way of your plans. James held his breath. But Langford continued, we will be monitoring closely. Ethan nodded. That's your right, he said. Langford looked at him, his eyes filled with complex emotions. You know, he said slowly, perhaps. We've become accustomed to not being challenged. Ethan smiled very slightly. And, perhaps, he replied, it's time someone did it. Langford said nothing more. Ethan and James left. Outside, the midday sun was high in the sky. The city is noisy. Life goes on. James patted Ethan on the shoulder. I just won a big game, he said. Ethan shook his head. No, he replied. It's just, I haven't lost yet. He looked up at the blue sky. There's one more part, he said. The hardest part. James frowned. What is that? Ethan exhaled. Show people that change is not punishment. A month after that flight, Ethan Carter returned to San Francisco Airport. No cameras, no escort, no prior notice. He was pulling a small suitcase, wearing a dark jacket and a simple baseball cap. Anyone glancing at him would think he was just an ordinary passenger, waiting for an early morning flight. And that's exactly what he wanted. The airport in the morning has a very unique rhythm. It's not as rushed as during peak hours. It's not as stressful as at night. The only sounds were the monotonous announcements from the loudspeaker, the rolling of suitcase wheels on the floor, and the pouring of coffee into paper cups. Ethan stood in line at the check-in counter. In front of him was an elderly man, his hands trembling as he handed over his documents. The counter attendant bent down, speaking slowly and patiently. Take your time, sir. Ethan stared at the scene for a long time, not because it's special, but because it should always be that way. It's your turn. The counter attendant was a young woman whose name tag read Alyssa. Good morning, she said, smiling. May I see your ID, please? Ethan handed over the documents. Alyssa checked it, typed a few keys, then looked up. Mr. Carter Kono, seat 2C. Boarding starts in about 20 minutes. Thank you, Ethan replied. She printed the boarding pass and handed it to him with both hands. Have a great flight, she said. That's all. No scrutinizing glance. No suspicion. No change in tone when he read his name. Ethan took his boarding pass and walked away. His heart sank slightly. Not because I'm sad, but because I feel relieved. In the waiting area, Ethan sat down in a chair near the window. He looked out at the runway. One plane is preparing to take off. Another has just landed. Hundreds of people came. Hundreds of people went. And he thought about the question that so many people had sent him in the past few weeks. Have you won yet? Ethan never knew how to answer. Because for him, this was never a battle to be won. The phone vibrates. A message from Laura Mitchell. Ethan, the first reports from the Open Door program are here. The number of responses has tripled, and the majority are positive. People say they feel safer speaking up. Ethan finished reading and smiled slightly. Another piece of news has arrived from James Holloway. The council approved the budget for the new cultural education program. No one objected, not even Langford. Ethan let out a soft sigh. He replied with a short message. Good. Thank you. He put away his phone. A boy about 10 years old sat in the chair opposite him, watching him intently. The boy pulled his mother's hand and whispered something. The mother smiled, looking at Ethan. Excuse me, she said. I was saying, you looked familiar. Ethan chuckled softly. You might see me online, he said. But today, I'm just a passenger. The boy nodded deep in thought. You're the guy on the plane, he said. The one who did nothing wrong, and yet you're handcuffed. The mother was a little confused. Idiot. Ethan raised his hand slightly. It's all right, he said. He looked at the boy. What do you think of that, he asked. The boy shrugged. I don't think it's fair, he said. But I didn't see you yelling. Ethan smiled. What did you learn from that, he asked. The boy thought for a long time. Then he spoke. I think, if I stay calm, others will listen. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. You're right, he said softly. The mother looked at him, her eyes welling up with tears. Thank you, she said softly. Ethan nodded. Thank you for raising such a thoughtful boy, he replied. When boarding began, Ethan lined up with everyone else. No privileges, no special treatment. He stood next to another black man in his early 30s, wearing a business suit. The man glanced at him, then hesitated for a second. Excuse me, he said. Are you? Ethan smiled. Perhaps he replied. The man exhaled. I just wanted to say, he said quickly. Thank you. I didn't stay silent at a meeting last week. Ethan looked at him. What happened? Ethan asked. They're blaming me for something I didn't do, the man said. Before I would have kept quiet. But this time, I said no. Ethan nodded. And the result, he asked. The man smiled. They listen, he said. Not immediately. But they listen. Ethan placed his hand very gently on his shoulder. That's enough, he said. On the plane, Ethan sat in seat 2C. Not first class. Not the nicest seats. But he likes this position. She smiled as the flight attendant walked past. Would you like some water, Kohoe? Yes, please, Ethan replied. She offered him water, neither hastily nor coldly. Ethan took it. Thank you, he said. She nodded and continued walking. A very brief moment. But Ethan knew that's exactly what he'd been trying to protect. It's not about personal honor. It's about those little moments being for everyone. The plane began to taxi. Ethan looked out the window. The city recedes into the background. In his mind, there were no longer images of handcuffs or police lights. There was only one very clear thought left. Power is not about proving yourself superior to others. Power is about ensuring no one is treated worse than they are because they are who they are. Ethan closed his eyes as the plane took off. He doesn't know what the future holds. He doesn't know how far these changes will go. But he knew one thing. The silence has been broken. And once that happens, the world will never be the same again. If you've heard this far, thank you for staying. If this story reminds you of yourself or someone you love, please share it. Not for fame, but to remind each other that respect is not a privilege. It is a fundamental human right. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. Because out there are still so many flights that need someone to speak up.